The 13th century BC in the Aegean was a century of armed conflict and political rivalry, which saw Mycenaean Greece active in western Anatolia, along with the Hittites, engaged in some sort of conflict which involved the Asua Confederation, which may possibly be the basis for the Homeric Trojan War, because one of the cities involved in this conflict was Ilium, probably the historical Troy. Later on in the century, in the eastern Mediterranean, Egyptian records tell of two battles fought against the mysterious sea peoples, whom some archaeologists speculate as having come from Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, although another idea is that they were from the Adriatic Sea. Around the same time, Greece entered some sort of period of turbulence, and quickly after this, the archaeology in the eastern Mediterranean shows evidence of destruction of cities, and general crisis, which we know today as the Late Bronze Age collapse, perhaps in part brought on by those mysterious sea peoples. But this was not the only region in the Bronze Age which shows evidence of large-scale armed conflict. In northeastern Germany, in the Tollense Valley, there are the remains of what appears to have been a battle. Warfare was not unusual in north-central Europe during the Bronze Age, but what stands out here is the scale. Archaeologists have uncovered hundreds, potentially even thousands of bones, some complete and some in just fragments. The site is dated to roughly 1250 BC or maybe a bit earlier, and at least 144 individuals have been identified. Most of the individuals here were men, between the ages of 16 and 40, and many of them had sustained injuries over their lifetimes which had healed to varying degrees of completion, and additionally there were some women and some children discovered among the dead. Weapons have also been recovered at the site, including a fragment of a bronze sword, axes, spears, and bronze and flint and bone arrowheads and clubs. So what was this? What exactly happened here? Well, we have three possibilities. Explanation number one is that this was the site of a cemetery. The excavations have not turned up evidence for large-scale ritual deposits or forms of burial associated with Bronze Age cemeteries in this part of Europe, so professionals don't think that this was really the case. Explanation number two is that this was the site of human sacrifice, maybe for religious purposes, but the bones don't show very much evidence of burst rib cages, or cut marks on the collarbone or cervical spine, or blows to the head, all in similar patterns which would indicate human sacrifice. The wounds on the skeletons are much more varied. The last option, then, is that this was some sort of a battle, which is what archaeologists have generally come to accept, which makes the Battle of Tollense River both exciting and extremely unusual, both because locating ancient battle sites is extremely difficult, and because, with only just a small portion of the site apparently excavated, archaeologists estimate the dead to number possibly in the upper hundreds, and with the total number of combatants thus numbering in the 1 to 2,000 range at the lower end of estimation, to possibly 3 to 4 to maybe even 5,000 at the higher end of estimation. Such numbers would not be out of place for a standing army or for some sort of alliance, but it's very strange for this part of Europe in this period because of the general lack of large-scale institutions which would give rise to those things. This then raises a question. What could have given rise to such conflict, and to such numbers? Do we actually have evidence of something that perhaps resembles a complex chiefdom, or maybe even a proto-state in Central Europe at this time? Well, this is where the archaeology becomes remarkably interesting, because we do potentially have evidence of something like that, and that evidence is extremely new. The European Bronze Age was a world that appears to have lacked writing, so what this means in terms of power structures and relationships is that when those structures were formed, they were usually visible to people. Somebody did not have power because they had a document stating that they were bestowed with authority by such and such a person from such and such a place. Instead, what they have are objects, which speak to their prestige and their authority. Among anthropologists, these objects are usually known as prestige goods, and their value is both symbolic and social because they come from somewhere outside the immediate cultural zone of control and influence. So with that in mind, the Bronze Age was a world where people moved, where different cultures, despite existing in their own localities, were intimately connected, in part because they had to be. That movement directly impinges on both this battle and on this mysterious political unit in Bronze Age Europe, because movement and prestige goods were how people got bronze in the first place. The older, linear explanation for societal development has human societies advancing, in material terms, from the Old Stone Age to the Middle Stone Age to the New Stone Age when farming developed, and then to the Copper Age, the Bronze Age, and finally to the Iron Age. This scheme, however, only works in certain areas of the world, and many places either don't have all of these stages, or go through them in different sequences, or they just don't. No matter how people develop the technology, though, in order to actually obtain bronze, societies required tin and copper, usually in a 12% and 88% ratio respectively, and although you can use arsenic instead of tin, tin appears to have been preferred. Central Europe didn't really have these resources at the time, at least not in great quantities, so these societies had to trade with others who did have access to them. There were 35 major copper mines ranging from Britain to Bulgaria, and several major sources of tin in Cornwall, Spain, Brittany, northern Italy, and south-central Germany. Controlling these trade networks were crucial for societies in Europe, and controlling even one of those routes bestowed unimagined power and prestige, so much so that the control was worth fighting and dying over. Ranging from northwestern Germany, east across to Poland, and then south to Austria, Slovenia, and the Czech Republic, the Unetice culture, which seems to have grown out of the corded ware and the bell beaker cultures present in the area, appears to have done just that. This culture utilized bronze implements, especially axes, and they controlled not the copper and tin routes, but a portion of what eventually became the Amber Road, which facilitated the trade in amber from the Baltic down to the Adriatic. Now, while amber initially appears to have come from Sicily, by about 2000 BC, amber originating in northern Europe came to dominate this trade, and it shows up, by about 1600 BC, in sites in Spain, Italy, Greece, and even in Egypt, especially in the tomb of the pharaoh Tutankhamun, more famously known as King Tut. Amber has been discovered in Britain, where it's especially associated with the Wessex culture, and that amber, in addition to other trade goods like daggers from Mycenaean Greece, probably functioned as prestige goods in Bronze Age Britain. Significant control of this trade in amber appears to have been crucial to Unetice wealth and power, and that culture imported tin from Britain and Spain and copper from the Italian Alps and Cyprus, for which they exchanged that amber. Now, just after about 2000 BC, elaborate, wealthy burials begin to show up in Central European sites associated with this archaeological culture, and they are so wealthy, in fact, that they're often termed princely burials by archaeologists. Probably the most famous burial is located at the site of Leubingen, where a man was buried with bronze weapons, including axes, daggers, and halberds, the style of which, if not the actual weapons themselves, appeared to have come from Irish examples. We can actually pinpoint this burial, thanks to dendrochronology, to 1942 BC, and the method of burial strongly suggests a fusion of earlier bell beaker and corded ware practices. Many of these burials, not all of them, but many of them, have other complexes associated with them in the general area, including what appear to be large buildings surrounding some of these burials, usually placed in a circle. These buildings, which archaeologists have come to understand to be barracks, usually contain 98 bronze axes, 2 daggers, and 2 double-bit axes. At one point, these were thought to be ceremonial objects. Now, because I brought up the C word in the context of archaeology, let me just address one thing briefly. You may, especially on YouTube and especially among interested non-professionals, run into an argument which says something along the lines of, if archaeologists don't know the purpose of the object, they just assume it is religious or ceremonial. And usually this is aimed in such a way as to suggest that archaeologists are not considering other possibilities. Among actual archaeologists and historians, this is not exactly what's happening. Sometimes that argument is made, if the overall context of the archaeological site suggests some sort of a ritual function. It is not something that archaeologists do with everything they uncover. And I'm bringing this up because in the context of these weapons, that ceremonial argument has actually been tweaked. The Unetice culture was a violent one, and we have plenty of evidence of armed conflict, fortified settlements, etc., essentially all the things that come to mind when we hear the term warfare. Because archaeologists estimate that Bronze Age Europe had a low population density per square kilometer, it used to be thought that, much like in other contexts, the burial of these weapons around the tombs of these men were done in a ritual fashion to display wealth and status. However, there is one grave, recently discovered and located at Börnhock in Saxony-Anhalt in Germany, dated to about 1800 BC, which is so richly furnished and so complex and so large compared to the other tombs, that archaeologists who specialize in the Unetice culture have argued that these other graves are not elites per se, but a second tier of elites, with the man buried at Börnhock being the first tier of elite, possibly something like a king. Börnhock has turned up 2,000 pieces of pottery and 6,000 animal bones, gold axes, and the gold hoard from the site at Dieskau probably originated here, possibly being looted. Indeed, the man buried at Börnhock has been theorized by some as to have been the owner of the famous Nebra sky disk. With that in mind, the axes and the general lack of violence and the presence of stability in a central core of the Unetice territory centered around the Harz Mountains has caused archaeologists to rethink the purpose of those axes. Those weapons, those axes, daggers, and 2-bit axes, were discovered in large structures surrounding these other burials. So some archaeologists have put forward the argument that these represent standing armies, with the 2-bit axes, which generally are ceremonial, at least from other cultural contexts in which things like that show up, functioning in a similar manner to ceremonial military swords today, and that the axes, which do actually show evidence of use, belong to low-ranking troops and the daggers to commanding officers, with the central burials then, in this interpretation, belonging to military commanders beholden to possibly some sort of a central king, one of whom was possibly buried at Börnhock. In the core region of the Unetice culture, the Harz Mountains, what we're possibly looking at is a proto-state in Bronze Age Europe, or perhaps several proto-states, as evidenced by what appears to be the legitimation of a ruling group, monumental architecture, an administrative hierarchy of some kind, and possibly even a standing army, or perhaps large warrior bands. All of this appears to have been predicated on control of amber coming in from the Baltic, with much of that amber being concentrated in Unetice sites. So, armies then, or at least large bands of troops, probably would not be out of place in this part of Europe, but the Unetice culture comes to an end between about 1600 and about 1500 BC, so it's about 250 years or so removed from the Battle of Tollense. But the archaeology does show evidence of continuity after its demise, as well as evidence of a totally new but equally complex form of societal organization, as well as large territorial units, although perhaps not on the size of the Unetice culture. So, what's going on here? The complex which both supplanted and grew out of the Unetice culture is known as the tumulus culture, which takes its name from the presence of burial mounds associated with it. Probably originating around the upper Danube or lower Rhine between 1600 and 1300, it dominated Central Europe and spread cultural tendrils out beyond that region as well, which brings our timeline just up to this battle. Much like the Unetice culture, the tumulus culture was characterized by fortified settlements and the control of the Baltic amber trade, and they traded with other cultures in Scandinavia, Atlantic Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Aegean. The end of the Unetice culture is evidenced by tells in some communities, especially in the northernmost reaches of that complex's zone, showing evidence of prolonged violence. The old way of viewing this, owing to the apparent speed of dissemination of the tumulus culture, whose burial practices are associated in some ways with the burial practices which appear on the Eurasian steppe, as well as the military character of many of the artifacts, was that this was some sort of an invasion. The idea used to be that the tumulus culture was evidence of speakers of Celto-Italic languages, a branch of the Indo-European family, moving into the area. However, further linguistic work and digging has indicated that Celto-Italic could have moved into Italy and Western Europe from elsewhere, or perhaps even before this, and that while conflict likely happened, it need not be quite so violent as was once imagined. On top of this rethinking, there also appears to have been societal problems in Central Europe around the end of the Unitice, including evidence that the tumulus culture had some local origins to it. So the more complex answer is that societal issues and warfare, possibly maybe some migration, perhaps being driven by changes in the climate which we do have evidence for, caused all of this. Perhaps, if the Unitice culture really was a proto-state, as some archaeologists think, then perhaps if it began to break up, that could help explain what we're reading in the archaeology. The general evidence for all of this happening is between about 1600 and about 1500, maybe 1450 BC, but experts still are not entirely certain on that date range. That general period, though, appears to have been one of trouble in southeastern Europe as well. The Ottomani culture, located mainly in present-day Romania and a portion of Hungary, shows evidence of fortified settlements with strong traces of defensive architecture. This was the first culture that we know of, right now anyway, in the area to use bronze swords, and there was a collapse of this culture, or it appears to be a collapse, around 1600, right around the same time that the Unitice culture was going away. This was fast, and this appears to have been violent. Burial practices in the region and architecture changed once things became stable again after a few generations, but with the end of this culture, those bronze swords appear to have diffused outwards, and became a feature of the tumulus burials. This has been suggested, in the context of the end of the Unitice culture, as leading not to a new standing army, but instead to the development of a new type of social structure based around warriorhood, control of copper deposits in the amber trade, and possibly a religious element as evidenced by the burial of these warriors in the tumuli with many weapons. Whatever the case, it certainly marks a sharp change from the apparent barracks of the Unitice culture. Over several decades, the older systems of early Bronze Age elites, ruling what appear to have been territorial units based around fortified settlements, declined, and they were replaced by the new fortified settlements of the tumulus culture, but with the warrior elite forming themselves apparently into bands, some of which appear to have wandered across Europe, accompanied by a religious association between warriors and the sun. With the decline of the Unitice culture and the apparent stability it brought, conflict engulfed much of the former region, and war started becoming a part of life to a degree that it was not previously. Bronze swords start being employed, and this likely led to changes in military organization and tactics. Along with this and the new warrior cult appears to be social reorganization based on lines of kinship around said warriors. There were also changes in metallurgical centers, and the popularization of bronze casting and shifts in long-distance trade networks meant that centers of actual control in Central Europe very likely changed. The success of this model then lay in three distinct areas. The power of hierarchized, decentralized kinship networks, in other words, a military group and their family. Control of resources and long-distance trade networks, once again it would seem, especially concerning amber from the Baltic, and the dissemination of metallurgical techniques for the creation of bronze swords. All of this leads us to the clash at Tollense Valley. Speaking very technically, this is not actually an archaeological site so much as it is a collection of archaeological sites, centered around a low-lying valley through which the Tollense River snakes. Today, the river is fairly deep and fast-flowing, in part due to millennia of use and in part due to recent construction and dredging projects altering the landscape. Back during the Bronze Age, though, the river was much shallower and wider, as well as much more slow-moving. The valley was too waterlogged for habitation, but we do have evidence of farmsteads and other population centers nearby. So, let's talk about these bones. It is not unusual, especially in a place where people have lived for thousands of years, to turn up a human bone in the process of tilling a field or constructing a building. Bones are made of organic materials, but they don't always totally break down. And prior to the 1990s, the odd bone or two was occasionally found, but these bones had a wide range of dates between the Middle Ages and farther back. That all changed in 1996, however. That year, some bones and a wooden club and a flint arrowhead embedded in one of those bones was discovered. Shortly after that, horse bones and a human skull with evidence of blunt force trauma were turned up, and all of these roughly were dated to about the same time period, about 1300 BC. In 2007, so about 10 years after the initial discoveries, over about a 2-kilometer stretch of river, the remains of 140 people were found, which soon increased to 144. Again, all belonging to roughly the same time period, about 1300 BC. One particular zone of excavation, called Velsen 20, turned up 77 of those 144 people, as well as many bronze and flint arrowheads. In 2015, the entire scope of the site changed because archaeologists found further remains and artifacts about 100 meters, or about 330 feet, away from the initial zones of excavation. More remains were discovered when underwater surveys were conducted. Many of those bones were hacked apart and disarticulated, with many showing evidence of what appeared to be killing blows, and along with those bones were fragments of a bronze sword. In a sense, really, the fact that these things survive at all is just pure luck, because the river seems to have scattered some of the remains and then they were just buried in mud, where they stayed hidden until modern times. So, what we're looking at then seems to be at least two groups of large bands of warriors, and some archaeologists have gone so far as to term them armies, perhaps on the Unetice model. So, what would have brought these people to the river valley? Well, this area was right at the center of a meeting point between trade routes connecting the northern amber trade, the British tin trade, and the Alpine and Mediterranean copper trades together. It would have been a crucial area during the European Bronze Age, which is why, it would seem, that around 1900 BC people built a causeway across the river, probably to help facilitate that trade. Of course, today we only have the remains of the causeway, but what we do have tells us that it was constructed of wood, stone, turf, large boulders, and sand, and ran for about 100 meters across the water. There were at least 300 wooden posts set into the riverbed, along with large boulders and wicker mats to reinforce the structure and help create a road atop it. From the artifacts we have uncovered in this general investigation, it appears to have been used up until the time of the Battle of Tollense River, and possibly even after, so for at least 600 years. Now, in the context of the Bronze Age and the apparent need to control at least a portion of a trade route, it would make sense that exerting control over this region would be a desirable thing to do. That being said, the region appears to have been lightly populated, so where did these people come from? Well, we have two main sources of evidence to help answer that question. The first, because we're talking about archaeology, are artifacts. There appear, based on the artifacts, to have been two main groups of people present here. The first group was likely local because we have uncovered arrowheads, dress pins, and other such things which are from that local area. The second group likely was from somewhere else because, well, the artifacts that we have uncovered, again, like arrowheads and dress pins, are of a type which appear to have originated farther south, in what is today the Czech Republic. Now, by itself, artifacts don't necessarily have to mean that the people using them migrated or otherwise moved. This was a period of trade and cultural diffusion, after all, but our other main source of evidence, isotope analysis, certainly puts the ball in that court. Archaeologists have taken dozens of samples from teeth specifically, and bones more generally, and strontium, oxygen, lead, and carbon deposits have all been analyzed, and we can more accurately pinpoint where the combatants originated. There are some outliers in the samples, but generally there are, once again, two groups. One group had strontium signatures, which tells us that they were from the Tollense Valley and the surrounding area, and the other group had strontium signatures, which tells us that they were from farther south, mainly from the Czech Republic and Austria, but also from Germany and southern Poland, really from an area roughly defined by Munich, Vienna, and Prague. These regions were several hundred kilometers from Tollense, at least at the farthest distances, so this really speaks, albeit indirectly, to an amazing feat. The Unetice culture appears to have had something like a standing army, so we know that this sort of thing was possible in the region. With the apparent rise of warriorhood and military cults, it's entirely possible that the capacity for standing armies did decline during the tumulus period, and in the cultures that immediately succeeded it after about 1300 BC. But we certainly have enough fortified settlements that a sizable band is not outside the realm of possibility. Either way, these warriors, and archaeologists have inferred that these were warriors because their bones show extensive evidence of sustained wounds over years, would have had to have been gathered together, especially because the isotope signatures tell us that they were spread over a wide area. That means that there would have, even if just for a little while, had to have been some sort of leadership and chain of command, and whether that leadership was charismatic, religious, or hereditary, it still had to have been exercised. You do not move that sort of force just because you feel like it. Supplies would very likely have been gathered, there likely would have been some sort of plan in place as well. So I think with that said, it's proper to really call what happened at the Tollense River all those years ago warfare in the proper sense. This was not a small-scale raid or skirmish. Now, attempting to reconstruct a course of events from archaeological remains is notoriously difficult, and it's difficult enough even when we have actual written sources. So, what can we say about what went down? Well, because the causeway spanning the river was a meeting point for the surrounding area, it's probably not outside the realm of possibility to suggest that the native group got wind of the outside force coming in. If a hostile group was going to be cut off, then the causeway would have been a good place to try and do that. However, there is one other perspective which argues that one of these groups was maybe a trade caravan, hence the presence of women and children, which was attacked, but that could also be explained by the outside army coming to attack a nearby village and everybody mobilizing for its defense. Whatever the case, at some point one of the groups attempted to cross the causeway and they were met with resistance. Unfortunately, we don't know the precise relationship between the artifacts and the bodies. It's likely that the warriors from the south had a higher percentage of bronze objects because we've actually found bronze objects in that region, while the locals had more wood and stone-based weapons like flint arrowheads, but that's not certain. It's possible that both groups were led by professional warriors, and if documented warfare from other regions, such as the Near East, can serve as a stand-in, it's possible that those were the people wielding bronze weapons. Whatever the case, we can tell from the archaeology that when one group tried to cross, they were probably hit by many, many arrows. After that, the fighting appears to have maybe broken up into localized skirmishes, and perhaps not all at once. Perhaps the fighting continued over days because some bones show evidence of trauma which was in the process of healing. At some point, one group appears to have attempted to move down the river bank, perhaps in an attempt to find a ford, and the other group appears to have followed, and there was another clash, but as of right now, saying anything more is likely to just be speculation. Ultimately, though, one side did lose. In order to really understand this battle, though, what we require is a multidisciplinary effort by a large team of scholars with a wide range of specializations. Since the genomic revolution in the first decade and a half of the 21st century, archaeology has become increasingly complex. It's not just about artifacts anymore. What archaeologists need to be able to do, aside from further excavation, is plot the isotope data from the bones so we can see how the battle actually unfolded. But, as it stands right now, the clash at this river and the knowledge we have of the archaeological cultures in Central Europe is revolutionizing what we think we know about Bronze Age Europe. This was a world which was deeply connected, and it was a violent world. If nothing else, the clash at the causeway stands as a stark testimony to that complexity and to that violence.